So, brain-generated cold fusion, which creates vitamins from seawater for underprivileged children, while reinforcing the security of the internet, sounds like a science fiction fantasy, but it's the world we're now living in. I just wanted to say it's the thing you get from sitting through an awful lot of TED things. It's either that or people saying, when I was born, I was just an ear. But now I stand before you as the head of a multinational company. Because of ants and empathy.
I hope someone has videoed it. Yeah,
So, I had no idea what I was going to do up here. I thought maybe... I actually got to do a kind of peculiar TED thing, because they asked me if I would tell a ghost story. And I thought, well, yeah, ghost stories. Yeah, all right. That'd be easy. So they got me a room in a strange, decaying gentleman's club. Probably person's club now, but it had obviously once been a gentleman's club. And with big leather sofas and candles flickering. And then I thought, why would I want to just tell a ghost story to these people? So I talked to them about fiction, and what makes us human, and why we tell each other scary stories. And I explained to them that the point of telling scary stories is inoculation, that you get to take and deal with a little bit of the things that scare and hurt and damage us. And you get to take it in fictional form, like the poisoners of the 17th century, who would ingest gradually tiny quantities of lots and lots of different poisons. So by the time they needed to have a poison meal with somebody and bump them off, they were completely immune to the poison. And I said, that's something that fiction can do. I talked about my book, Coraline. Was anyone here when I came through last year on the Ocean at the End of the Lane tour at the Vogue? And I did, that's good, some of you were. So I did this giant idiot tour last year, of the kind you can only convince yourself to do by saying it's the last one I will ever do. So it was much, much, much too long, and we did it in venues that were too large. So, you know, 1,500, 1,700, 2,000 people, and if you've ever signed books for 2,000 people a night, after going on stage and doing an hour on stage and then a Q&A, it's no fun, but you do it and you keep going. And one of the things that kept me going was a completely new phenomenon for me. Something new since the last time I did a big signing tour, which was young women, normally aged somewhere between about 22 and 26, who would get to the front of the line and they'd stood there for many hours holding their copies of Coraline. And they normally weren't nice copies of Coraline. Normally these were incredibly cheap, scholastic books, printed for schools edition on the cheapest paper, published in 2002, 2003, 2004, and they were battered, and they were holding on to them for dear life. And they would get to the front of the line, and they would be all shivery and scared, and I would ask if they wanted a hug, because it was like, this was not rocket science. I got to say that yesterday to an astrophysicist. You know, would you like a hug? And they'd come down, and I would hug them, and they would tell me, in as briefly as they had, because there would be 500 people still on the line behind them, about times of abuse, about physical, mental, sexual, about being bullied, about what they went through, sometimes just about life, throwing them a really hard curve, both parents dying, things getting really bad. And they would tell me that Coraline got them through. And Coraline is a book about a little girl who goes through some very scary, very obviously fictional things. She goes through a door that shouldn't exist in her house and encounters her other mother and her other father, who look just like the ones that she left behind, only they have big black buttons for eyes, and they're really sweet, apparently, and they want her to stay with them and become their little girl, as soon as they've sewn big black buttons into her eyes. And it's how she escapes and how she defeats the other mother. And it's a solid work of horror fiction for children, that people say, why the hell would you write something like that? And learning from these young women that it did what I hoped, which was they would tell me, each in her own way, but very often using these words, that there will be a point in their lives, or lots of points during their teenage years, where they would think, Caroline got through worse than this, I could be like her. Caroline, the thing that I learned from Caroline was, it's not that you're not scared, it's not that you're not hurt, it's that you are scared and you are hurt and you keep going and you do the right thing anyway. And that's bravery, and I thought I could be like that. And for some of them, it simply offered an escape, a place they could go when things got bad, and they were holding this book. And they'd been 11, 12, 13, 14 when the book got published. And you know, the age when you really need something like that, and you know, and I'm not claiming any kind of magical virtue in my book or my writing or anything. It was, I'm just saying, it was the book that told them those things and gave them those things when they were there. And it inoculated. It gave them the strength. They got to be very scared of it, and they got to be scared by things, and they got to rehearse. And when the bad stuff came, they knew what it was. And that's what I told them before I read them a ghost story the other night. Thank you. Person who clapped. So I was listening, so changing the subject with a jerk and a horrible lurch. Was listening to Amanda and Jason talking about the whole corporate thing. And I'd watched JR's talk with a huge fascination, because I got to go through this personally. I got to go through this personally about a year ago, when I was approached by that Canadian institution, BlackBerry. And they said, would you like to do whatever you'd like in social media? And I said, I guess, what's the catch? And they said, well, what would you like to do? I said, well, I've had this mad fan, you know, they said, if you had the resources, what would you do? And I started thinking about the kinds of things I've been playing around with doing that I dismissed, because I would actually need staff, I would need help. If I was going to do this thing, I would need people to help me. And I said, well, but I had this weird little fantasy, which in my head is called a calendar of tales. And I love the idea of just involving people. The whole point for me on Twitter is establishing a one-to-one connection and demythologizing. And somebody who did that amazingly well during the 1960s and 70s was an American writer named Harlan Ellison. And Harlan, mainly a science fiction writer, although he would kick me if he heard me saying that, a fabulist, a futurist, an imaginer of impossible things. But Harlan used to write in shop windows. And he'd do a deal with a store, where instead of doing a signing, he'd come and he would set up his typewriter in their window. And the deal would be if you bought more than $100 of books from that store, you could suggest a title, a book title to Harlan. You'd write down your title and you'd put it, or a short story title, and you'd put it in a fish tank and he would fish it out and he'd look at a few of them and then he'd grab one and he'd write a story. And many of his most famous stories started life in store windows. And I asked him why he did it, and he said he wanted to demythologize the process of writing. He wanted to show people it was a craft like building a chair, and that mostly it was done by sitting there and staring at a blank piece of paper and hating everything. And then you type. And I thought, I love that idea. I love the idea of just showing people that you make art by making art. That's how you do it. So I went out to the internet. I asked a bunch of questions. The January question was what's the most dangerous? Why is January dangerous? What did you find that you'd lost in February? What's the strangest thing? You know, what did you wish for in October? What would you burn in November? And getting these wonderful replies, all of which were like art, and some of which were absolutely heartbreaking, and many of which were true. And then just pretty much, because they were coming in by the thousands, just grabbing one at random, grabbing 12 at random, and using them, just finding, going, oh, that sounds okay, you know, here's 5 of them, let's contact the people who wrote them, make sure they're okay with me, just using them as a starting point for a story. And if it's okay with you, I will read you a very, very short story that began life as one of those.